Transparency has a lot of definitions, and that's partly one of the issues we have. In my view, transparency is about understanding. It's not necessarily just, at least, about visibility. It's much more about understanding the component parts of the sum. And that's where we've really failed as an industry, I think, and as agencies, to provide the understanding rather than just show something that you couldn't necessarily understand. I think in terms of transparency, we have, it's obviously the biggest crisis the advertising industry has ever had. There's a massive, the transparency crisis has evolved into a trust crisis. And I personally think that we have, we've fallen deep and are now on the way to building it back up. I certainly hope that, but I also fundamentally think we are. I think there's a much bigger understanding from all parties involved what's needed in order to create transparency and understanding, but also what can be done. And there's an understanding that you can't just ask for full transparency because there is not necessarily such a thing. But then that comes back to getting understanding rather than just visibility of things, which is something we need to create together, and we need to come together as an industry to create that. And I feel we're on the way to develop that and install that back into the industry. I'm not sure there are any short-term wins in terms of transparency. I think we all need to brace ourselves and get into it for the long run. We need to make sure that this is a sustainable understanding and transparency that's been built by the entire industry, and that is it's founded in all the different parts of the industry and accepted by all the parts of the industry. We can't have agencies on one side saying that this is the type of transparency that we are willing to give, advertisers saying, well, we want a different type of transparency, and all the intermediates in between having to choose sides between that. That's not going to cut it. It's not going to get us out of the trust and transparency crisis. We need to come together and agree on what is our definition of transparency and how much understanding do we need in order to create the level of transparency that's needed for all the component parts of the industry. In order to really build transparency, we need to sort of back off a bit and get to the same level playing field. We need to come together to solve the problems instead of complaining about the other part's position on the issue. I fully understand the advertiser's position to demand full transparency, but they also need to understand that there is not necessarily such a thing as full transparency in a very, very complex supply chain environment. And therefore, both sides need to have an understanding, and we certainly from an agency point of view need to have a lot more understanding of both the industry and the issues that we have in the industry, but also that the advertiser's perspective and need for more transparency. It's real and it's not going to go away. And at the same time, they need to understand what we can and what we can't do in this environment. I think the biggest obstacles in the road to achieving full transparency is the fact that we are dealing with a very, very complex supply chain. And a complex supply chain will not necessarily always be able to have transparency in every single level. And that's why the definition of transparency, which I would say is more like understanding than actual transparency, is crucially important, because you need to understand at what level do you actually need the transparency. You would want to have transparency in every level. Well, where do you actually need it? And then once that's defined, we need to all work on getting transparency and understanding installed at that level. And then everyone who sits at different sides at that specific point in the supply chain can deal with that however they have to. But you can't necessarily have full transparency. You cannot have full transparency in any supply chain, in any buying and selling relationship throughout the world. From an agency perspective, simply because we do not control the whole supply chain. So we cannot give full transparency because we don't have full transparency. So we will always run into these obstacles in any supply chain. If you ask a supermarket, an FMCG advertiser, or just distributor retail, they will all have these issues and they have overcome them. We need to overcome them as well. We can only do that by coming together as an industry, trying to solve the problem rather than slinging mud at each other. I think it's very difficult to point to just one thing that is the most exciting thing in media and in digital media right now. And there's so much going on. It's such exciting times. So it's almost like the time we're in right now is the most exciting thing, because there's never been more change, there's never been more disruption, and there's never been more opportunity as well. But if I had to really point to one thing, I think it would be addressable TV, because for me, that's interesting and crucial for the industry, because it sits right at the inflection point between traditional media and the new media. And it will take all the cool things that we can do in digital media about targeting, and it will apply them to the traditional media that we still know work and we still love, as an industry and as agencies and advertisers. And if we can get that right, we have literally built the future of advertising and an advertising industry and a media industry.